In this chapter, we will speak about using the Microsoft Graph API or working with Azure AD. Very often you will use flows to work with Azure AD. So let's talk about how you can set up an authorization and make a call with the Microsoft Graph API. First, you need to go to the Azure Active Directory admin portal. And you have to click on Azure Active Directory and find App Registrations in the menu. Click on New Registration and give it a name. I'm going to call it Flows OAuth Endpoint. And register. This will create now an endpoint with an application ID, as you can see here, and that will be the client ID to use eventually for your authorization inflows. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to store it in my user portal under a secret item where I add a custom field, a client ID, flows client ID, save it because obviously I will need it later on. Next thing we need to do is to add a certificate or secret. Click on New Client Secret and give it a description. Flows OAuth secret. I'm going to put it on 730 days, add it. And this will now expose a new client and the value will be the client secret. So this is a little bit confusing because you can see the secret ID, but it's the value which will be the client secret. So I'm going to save that as well. You could copy and paste it in a notepad or something, but just keep it somewhere because you will need it to set up the flows authorization. We also have to add permissions or scope, and there is a default scope, but I'd like to add some more permissions because I'd like to query for users and group memberships and so on. So I'll click on Microsoft Graph Application Permissions and we search for, or we go to search for user. Under the user, you'll find a lot of scopes that you can grant. Let's click them all. User read write for at least. Manage identities. This obviously depends upon what you like to do with the Microsoft Graph call, what permissions that you would need. I'm also going to add some permissions for group memberships so that I can work with group memberships. So again, click on the Graph Application Permissions, search for group. I'm going to check all the permissions. Group membership, read and write all. And add the permission. You now have to click on Grant Admin Consent to Page Console. So you can see it's not granted yet. So click on that button, say yes, and it will then grant all the accesses. And as you can see, now it is all granted for PH Console. Okay. Click on the endpoints to find the links that you will need for the authorization token, etc. Copy the token endpoint. And now let's go to flows and set up an authorization. Give it a name. I'm going to give it AD client credentials. Choose for OAuth 2. Use client credentials. And change the application of the content type to application X www form URL encoded. So the token endpoint version 2, copy it to clipboard. That's where we will need to go to get a token. You have to add scopes. For the scope, just add HTTPS graph microsoft.com/dot, don't forget the dot default. Yeah, that's correct. Client ID, that's the ID that we saved earlier. So copy the client ID, paste it in, and do the same thing for the client secret. Okay, I think we're all set. Save it. Authentication added. Now click on authorize. And yes, the authorization is successful. Okay. We should now be able to run a query. So let's create a new flow. Let's create a new connector. We have some templates available as well, but I'm going to create just a new one. I need to set the authorization to the AD client creds that I've just set. And we have to fill in the hostname, of course. That will be graph version 1 groups. Actually, I'm going to set this as the base path or the path. And it is a get that we need. I don't need the HTTPS. That will be added automatically by flows. And I think this should be okay. Now let's rename the flow a Azure or AD get groups. And let's save it and run the flow. Okay, let's take a look at the results. Click on the endpoint, object, received, response, body, value, that's an array, so it's returning me some things. And yes, we can see here now the groups returned by the API call. Working with Microsoft Graph often require you to use variables in the path. And let's make an example here where we will query by the use of Microsoft Graph. I'm filling in the graph path. Version 1. Users. And let's save this and run it. So this will return now users in my Azure AD tenant. Let's see, received, response, body, value, an array of 2 elements. Okay, and as you can see here, the Azure user that has a certain ID, and I'm going to copy this ID and call the API with a path. I'm going to create a parameter. We've seen this before of the location path. I'm going to call it the ID, description user ID. And I have to fill in the value here that I just copied. And now I'm going to add to my call a slash. And in between curly brackets, ID, so the name of the parameter that I've just created. I'm going to run this. And let's look at the results. The query was successful. And it should now return received. So it has sent, as you can see here, a link with the path parameter, which is appended to the URL. So it has filled in the URL. And it has returned now all the details of this user with that specific ID. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add some query parameters, and that will allow me to define which fields will be returned. So I'm going back to my API call, the flow, and I'm going to create a new parameter, and that won't be a path location, but that will be location in the query. And I'm going to give it a name, $select. And I'm going to fill in what fields I would like this API call to return. The ID, display name, on-premise extensions, and mail. I'm going to run this. And now let's look at the results when it's finished. And you will find now that the parameters, the path is still there, of course, for that specific user. But also we have a query parameter now, the select. And in the results, you will find that only those fields that I've asked for in that query, so the select, that only those are returned, including the on-premise extension attributes.